Okay, first of all, anyone not receive an outline for this morning's study, raise your hand. Will the ushers pass them out? A few hands scattered. If the ushers can come forward and pass these out, just keep your hands up. Our first study was on the rapture of the church, in which we discussed both the event and the timing of this event that will be limited to those who are church saints. And I'm going to discuss the tribulation, not so much the tribulation in general, but specifically how Israel is involved with the tribulation. And by way of introduction, let's turn to the first passage on your outline, the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 32. The book of Deuteronomy, chapter 32. Chapter 32, verse 8. When the Most High gave to the nations their inheritance, when he separated the children of men, he set the bounds of the peoples according to the number of the children of Israel. For Jehovah's portion is his people, and Jacob is the lot of his inheritance. Now, God has an overall prophetic program. We often subdivide this prophetic program into three separate plans because God does have a plan for the church. He has a plan for Israel. He has a plan for the Gentile nations. All three of God's plans of his overall prophetic program somehow center around the Jewish people. To the extent that Moses writes that when God providentially laid down what become the borders of various nations over the centuries, that was somehow based upon the number of Jews that play a role in that nation's history. In verse 8, it refers to God as the Most High, and according to Genesis chapter 14, verses 18 through 20, Genesis 14, 18 through 20, whenever God is called the Most High, it emphasizes God as the possessor of the heavens and the earth. As the possessor of this earth, he can subdivide the earth as he wills and give a portion of the earth to whatever tribe or people or nation he chooses. And when he providentially laid down become the borders of the USA, that was somehow based upon the number of Jews that play a role in American history. As verse 9 declares, for Jehovah's portion is his people, and Jacob is the lot of his inheritance. The tribulation is a period of time of 7 years of the wrath of God being poured out that will cover the whole world in general. As we'll see in our study this morning, even God's plan for the tribulation centers around his plan and program for the Jewish people. Now we'll study this basic theme in the four areas that are on your outline. We'll first of all deal with the Jews and the purposes of the tribulation, how the Jews correlate with the start of the 7 years, or the purpose of the 7 years. Secondly, we'll discuss the Jewish role in the start of the 7 years of tribulation. Thirdly, we'll talk about the Jews in the tribulation, what happens to them during this period of time. And then fourthly, but briefly, we'll cover the Jewish role in the end of the tribulation. Now for the, moving on to the first point, Roman numeral 2 in your outline, the Jews and the purposes of the tribulation. From the many passages, we can deduct that God has three major reasons for the tribulation. And the first purpose applies to both Jews and Gentiles equally alike, which is to make an end of wickedness and wicked ones. To make an end of wickedness and wicked ones. Now again, that applies equally to both Jews and Gentiles and goes beyond our specific theme this morning. I will not develop this first purpose. You'll find it in the passages on your outline, Isaiah chapter 13, verse 9, and also Isaiah chapter 24, verses 19 and 20. But the second and third purpose, however, direct relationship with God's purposes for Israel. Let's turn to the Revelation 7 passage. Revelation chapter 7. In the Matthew 24:14 passage on your outline, he spells out the purpose when he says, the gospel will be proclaimed throughout the whole world to all nations before the end comes. And the one statement he makes in Matthew 24:14 is now given a full chapter of exposition by Revelation chapter 7, in that verses 1 through 8 deal with the means of the accomplishing the purpose, and Revelation 7, 9 through 17 with the results. But the second purpose is to bring about a worldwide revival, to bring about a worldwide preaching of the gospel, and with it, a worldwide revival. The major purpose of Revelation is not so much to give us some new information prophetically. The last two chapters are primarily all new information. But the main purpose of the book is to provide us a chronological sequence of prophetic events. And most of the material you'll find in chapter 6 to chapter 20 are found in the Old Testament, most of it. The trouble is, it was scattered all over the Old Testament. It would have been impossible for anyone to sit down and pull all this material together and put in chronological sequence. And so Revelation does that for us. It takes many of the prophecies out of the Old Testament and gives us the chronology by which these events will be fulfilled. And so chapter 6 to chapter 18 deal with events of the 7 years of tribulation, and chapters 6 through 9 deal with events of the first half, chapters 10 through 14 with the events of the middle, and chapters 15 through 18 with the events of the second half. So keep in mind, the events of chapter 7 occur in the first 3.5 years of the tribulation period. It will begin with verse 1. After this I saw 4 angels standing at the 4 corners of the earth, holding the 4 winds of the earth, that no wind should blow on the earth or on the sea or upon any tree. And I saw another angel ascend from the sun rising, having the seal of the living God, and he cried with a great voice to 4 angels who was given to hurt the earth and the sea, saying, Hurt not the earth, neither the sea nor the trees, until we will have sealed the servants of our God on their foreheads. And I heard the number of them that were sealed, 144,000, sealed out of every tribe of the children of Israel. Then verse 5, 6, 7, 8 go on to state 12,000 from these specific 12 tribes mentioned, giving us a grand total of 144,000 Jews. And by means of these 144,000 Jews, God will accomplish the proclamation of the gospel around the world. Looking at this from a purely human perspective, I wish to conduct a worldwide revival in a short period of time, like 3.5 years. I could not think of a better group of people to use than Jewish people. Now, coming from me, that might not sound all that objective. So let me see if I can back it up a bit. If you survey the missionary situation around the world today, you soon discover the vast majority of missionaries around the world come from the English-speaking world, and the majority of those happen to be Americans. And if you interview how much time they spend in training before they're comfortably proclaiming the word of God in a new language, after becoming believers, they have to think in terms of 3 or 4 years of a Bible college or seminary. And while they're not prepared then to proclaim the word in the English-speaking world, not so ready in a different language-speaking country, the next 2, 3, 4 years must be spent in language studying. They will need to communicate the gospel in that tongue. The average English-speaking missionary spends a minimum of 6 years or more in training before he's comfortably proclaiming the word in a new language. These events occur in 3.5 years. There's simply not that much time to play with. And that's where you have the advantage of using Jewish people, because first of all, the Jews are dispersed throughout the world. As a result, all of the world's major languages and a great number of the world's minor languages are spoken by some Jews somewhere. And furthermore, these Jews come from the 4 winds of the earth, so they won't only come from Israel, they come from all over the world. With the American Jew being the exception to the rule, most Jews are minimally bilingual, speaking 2 or more languages fluently. Now, I speak 2 languages, but both my parents spoke 5 languages. In fact, my mother is still living, and she works for the Jewish Federation of Los Angeles as a translator. If she was to become a believer, she could witness in 5 different languages without first going to language school. And so the language element is already present. Also, the American Jew being the exception to the rule, most Jews around the world do receive at least a basic introduction to the Old Testament. They have some ideas of what the Old Testament is teaching, whether they come from an Orthodox or secular society. So after God raptures the church, he will proceed to save 144,000 Jews. They already speak the languages which are essential. They already have a knowledge of the Old Testament. All they may need is, say, the 10 basic steps of Campus Crusade for Christ. And very quickly they can begin to proclaim the word throughout the world. In essence, that's approximately what will occur. And by means of these 144,000 Jews, God will proclaim the gospel throughout the world. Let me go ahead and answer a question that always comes up anyway. Often people say there are two tribes which are missing. And one tribe they say is missing would be the tribe of Ephraim, but Ephraim is not missing, but the tribe of Joseph in verse 8 is accounting for the tribe of Ephraim, and Joseph was Ephraim's father. In the Old Testament, sometimes Joseph is used as a substitute for either Manasseh or Ephraim. But the one tribe that is missing is the tribe of Dan, and people have engaged in all kinds of guessing games as to why Dan happens to be missing. Every time you hear someone give you a reason, you ask him what's the evidence for it, it'll be rather subjective reasoning, because it doesn't come out and say why Dan happens to be missing. So people have engaged in speculations like the Antichrist will come from the tribe or the false prophet will come from the tribe. But if you simply go back to the way the Old Testament numbers the tribes, you will see very quickly why one tribe is missing. Because if you make a list of all the tribes of Israel, you'll always end up with 13 names, not 12. Jacob had only 12 sons, but the tribe of the son Joseph produces two separate tribes. Manasseh and Ephraim together make up the tribe of Joseph. And so if you make a list, you end up with 13 names. To maintain the symmetry of 12, you have to drop one name. And this is not the only place it happens. For example, in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 33, where Moses gives his 12 tribal blessings, he drops the name Simeon to maintain the symmetry of 12. In my travels, everywhere I travel around the world, people ask me, why is Dan missing from Revelation 7? No one ever asks me, why is Simeon missing from Deuteronomy chapter 33? Obviously, everybody reads Revelation. Nobody reads the book of Deuteronomy anymore. And that does not help Moses maintain his royalties at all. But to maintain the symmetry of 12, you have to simply drop a name. In the book of Ezekiel chapter 47, as Ezekiel describes the settlement of the land, to maintain the symmetry of 12, he drops the name of Levi, putting Levi in a whole separate category. And John simply drops the name of Dan. It's that simple, to maintain the symmetry of 12. And Revelation presupposes a knowledge of the Old Testament, and often, if we go back to the Old Testament, we can determine what these various elements mean. Now, the proclamation of the gospel is one thing, but the reception of it is quite another. So what will be the reception of the message? Verse 9, after these things, after what things? After 144,000, I saw and behold a great multitude, which no man could number, out of every nation, of all tribes and peoples and tongues, standing before the throne and before the Lamb, arrayed in white robes and palms in their hands. Skip down to verse 13. One of the elders answered, saying unto me, these who are arrayed in the white robes, who are they, whence came they? And I say unto him, my Lord, you know. He said to me, these are they that come out of the great tribulation, and they washed the robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. Next thing John sees is myriads and myriads of Gentiles standing before the throne of God. Gentiles, he says, that come out of every nation, every tribe, every single language group. And when he asks about the identity of these myriads of Gentiles, the answer is, these are the Gentiles who come out as believers from the great tribulation, for they washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. As a result of the preaching of 144,000 Jews, myriads of Gentiles will come to saving faith. And in this manner, God will accomplish the second purpose of the tribulation, to bring about a worldwide revival. This revival will be so extensive with such a tremendous success rate will create a deep sense of envy on the part of every Baptist evangelist you ever have met or will meet. We may see local revivals nowadays. We may even see national revivals nowadays. The only time the Bible speaks of a worldwide revival is when it will be conducted by these 144,000 Jews. For the third purpose, we'll move on to Daniel chapter 12. Daniel chapter 12. Now, beginning in chapter 11 of this book, the prophet is being given a vision in which he can see what conditions would be like for his people, the Jewish people, during the time of the tribulation. And the vision that begins in chapter 11 continues into chapter 12 and terminates with verse 4. Then in verse 5, a question will be raised as just how long will these terrible days for Israel be allowed to continue? And when the answer is given, he also gives us the third purpose, which is to make an end of the will of the holy people. Verse 5, now Daniel looked, and behold, there stood a tomb, the one on the brink of the river on this side, and the other on the brink of the river on that side. And one said to a man clothed in linen was above the waters of the river, how long will he be to the end of these wonders? And I heard the man clothed in linen was above the waters of the river, when he held up his right hand, left unto heaven, and swore by him forever and ever, that it shall be for a time and times and a half. Now note, and when they have made an end of breaking in pieces the will or power of the holy people, all these things shall be finished. These terrible days of judgment must continue until finally the stubborn will is broken, until they turn away from seeking to establish their own righteousness and seek the righteousness of God through Jesus the Messiah. Now, while Daniel 12, verse 7 tells us what the third purpose is, to break in the will of the holy people, one prophet earlier, Ezekiel chapter 20, informs us just how this is going to be accomplished. Ezekiel chapter 20. We'll begin with verse 34, Ezekiel chapter 20, and verse 34. And now bring you out from the peoples, and will gather you out of the countries wherein you are scattered, with a mighty hand, with an outstretched arm, with wrath poured out, and I'll bring you into witness of the peoples, and there will enter into judgment with you face to face. Like as I entered into judgment with your fathers, the dwellers of the land of Egypt, so will enter into judgment with you, says the Lord Jehovah. And I will cause you to pass under the rod. I'll bring you to the bond of the covenant. And I'll purge out from among you the rebels and them that transgress against me. I'll bring them forth out of the land where they sojourn, but they will not enter into the land of Israel. And you shall know that I am Jehovah. Now in these verses, Ezekiel draws a simile with the Exodus. At the Exodus under Moses, God brought the entire people of Israel out of Egypt and brought them into the wilderness of the Sinai Peninsula. And God's program for Israel in the Sinai was to accomplish two things. First of all, they were to receive the Mosaic law. Secondly, they were to build a tabernacle through which much of the law could then be maintained. And then with these two things accomplished, they were to press on and into the promised land itself. But because of a series of murmurings, rebellings against the revealed will of God, at the oasis of Kadesh Barnea, which is right on the border of the promised land, God entered into judgment with his people. And the judgment was that all those who came out of Egypt would not have to continue wandering till 40 years pass. In that 40-year period, all who came out will die out except for 2 good spies and those below the age of 20. So 40 years later was a new nation, a nation that was born as free men in the desert, not as slaves in Egypt, that will not enter land under Joshua. Now that historical frame of reference becomes the background for something future, but now he says he regathers people from all parts of the world. The regather we've been seeing with the present Jewish state of Israel. But at some point he'll once again enter into judgment with his people, and by means of tribulation judgments, the rebels will be purged out, and those who survive in verse 37 will be brought into the bond of the covenant, the bond of the new covenant. There'll be a new nation, a regenerate nation. They'll then be allowed to enter the land under King Messiah for the Messianic kingdom. But here again, Ezekiel describes a period of judgment that will bring them to national salvation. You can redefine the third purpose to be to bring about Israel's national salvation, to bring about Israel's national regeneration. Insofar as the purposes is concerned, two of the three major purposes involve the Jewish people. Go to page 2 of your outlines and now turn to Daniel chapter 9. The next thing to discuss is the Jews and the start of the tribulation, how they relate to the beginning of these 7 years. Now in Daniel chapter 9, verses 24 through 27, we have Daniel's famous prophecy of the 77s, the 490-year period God has decreed over the Jewish people. This goes beyond our purpose to go through the passage phrase by phrase. It would take much more time than we have. If you're involved in Jewish ministries, this is a passage you have to know well because it's the only prophecy that gives us an actual timetable for the first coming. If you have done this or will do so, what you discover is that by the end of verse 26, the first 483 years of this 490-year period has already been fulfilled in history, coming to an end at the time of the first coming. There's still 7 years left to run of this prophetic time clock of Israel, and the question now is, what will be the one singular event that will begin these 7 years ticking away? And this brings us now to Daniel chapter 9 and verse 27. And he shall make a firm covenant with many for 1 7. The pronoun he goes back to his nearest antecedent, which is found in verse 26 as the prince that shall come. In other words, the prince that shall come, or verse 26, and the he who makes a covenant in verse 27 is the one, the same individual, better known in our circles as simply the Antichrist. And Dan uses a definite article, the prince that shall come, because he spoke of him twice before in Daniel chapter 7, again in Daniel chapter 8. He shall make a firm covenant with many for 1 7. In the middle of the 7, he will cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease. And upon the wing of abominations will come one who makes desolate. And even to the full end, and that determined, shall wrath be poured out upon the desolate. The 7 years of tribulation begin with one specific event, the signing of a 7-year covenant between Israel and the Antichrist. Now, I cannot stress too strongly, it will not be the rapture of the church per se that triggers the tribulation. As you know from yesterday's study, I have a firm belief in the pre-tribulational rapture. But that simply means the rapture must come sometime before the tribulation starts. Maybe it'll happen just before the tribulation starts. Maybe it'll happen 10, 20, 30 years before the tribulation starts. But the starting point of the tribulation is not the rapture, but the signing of the 7-year covenant. Until this covenant is signed, the tribulation simply cannot begin. So the rapture could easily come today. If it does, the tribulation will not start tomorrow. The world stage is not yet set for the tribulation to begin. Now, this presupposes there are two other things in place before the tribulation could begin. One is and one is not. This, first of all, presupposes that there is a Jewish state with a Jewish government with whom a covenant like this could be signed. And we have had that since 1948. And this prophecy requires the Jewish state to exist before the tribulation and we now have such a Jewish state. The second thing this presupposes is that the Antichrist is already in high political authority before the tribulation, with whom a sovereign state like Israel could sign a covenant of this nature, and that point is not yet in place. Now, note three other things in this passage. First of all, the covenant is made with many, but not with all. There'll be a segment of the Jewish population that will refuse to have anything to do with the covenant. Secondly, although the covenant is made to last for 7 years, it won't last that long because at the midpoint, after 3.5 years, the covenant is broken. And then thirdly, the result of the breaking of the covenant is that abominations and desolations fall upon the Jewish people. Now, the covenant that triggers the tribulation is viewed by Daniel 9:27, is viewed from a human perspective. And from a human viewpoint, there'll be a 7-year treaty that simply will not last as long as it was intended to. Moving on to our next passage in your outline, Isaiah chapter 28 will give us God's perspective on the same covenant that begins the 7 years of tribulation. Isaiah 28. Isaiah chapter 28. In verse 14, we are given God's perspective on the many who make the covenant. Wherefore, hear the word of Jehovah, ye scoffers, that rule this people that is in Jerusalem. In God's viewpoint of the many, the leaders of Israel in power to sign covenants of this nature is to call them scoffers or fools. That's because of his perspective on the covenant itself in verse 15. Because ye have said, we made a covenant with death, at which you all are in agreement, and when the overflowing scourge shall pass through, will not come unto us. We made lies our refuge, and the falsehood have we hidden ourselves. It's in verse 15 that we discover the actual reason why they make such a covenant to begin with. When you talk about biblical symbols, there's a great many symbols used, but there is a consistency in biblical symbolism, in that any one symbol will be used the same way through both testaments about 95% of the cases. There's a 5 percentile where the symbol could be used more than one way, but 95% of the cases, one symbol used the same way through both testaments. For example, whenever the word star is used symbolically, it's a symbol of an angel. Whenever the word cloud is used symbolically, it's a symbol of God's glory. Whenever the word stone is used symbolically, it's a symbol of the Messiah. When the word mountain is used symbolically, it's a symbol of a king or kingdom or throne. And when the figure of a flood is used symbolically, it symbolizes a military invasion. We have that figure used here in verse 15 with the overflowing scourge. The word security is the most important single word in Israeli foreign policy. Israel has fought 4 major wars with the Arab states over the issue of Israeli security. The bombing of the Iraqi nuclear reactor more than a decade ago is over the issue of Israeli security. The war against the PLO in Lebanon is over the issue of Israeli security. The off again negotiations all focus on Israeli security. But situation will rise in the future that they will come to feel the only hope they have of gaining security is by making this covenant with the Antichrist. And God says, you're fools for thinking so. This is not a covenant of heaven, but of hell, not a covenant of life, but of death. There's a common misconception the Jewish people accept the Antichrist as the Messiah. That is nowhere said in Scripture or taught in Scripture. They will not accept him as the Messiah, but they will make a covenant with him, guaranteeing Israeli security. And they put their trust into that covenant, and that's why it triggers the tribulation. And the same 3 things we saw in Daniel 9:27 happen in this context as well. In verse 16, we read of the non-many that have nothing to do with the covenant. The Jewish people of that day, they'll put their faith in the stone, and the stone used symbolically refers to the Jewish Messiah. And these are Jews living in the tribulation who have come to faith and won't go along with the covenant. Secondly, in Daniel 9:27, the covenant was broken. The same thing happens here in verse 18. Your covenant with death shall be annulled. Your agreement with Joel will not stand. And when the overflowing skirt shall pass through, then you shall be trodden down by it. As in Daniel 9:27, so here the covenant is broken, it is annulled, it won't last as long as it was intended to. And in place of being exempt from many further military problems, do not become subject to it. Now, the third thing in Daniel 9:27 was the result of the breaking of the covenant will cause desolations falling upon the Jewish people. The same thing happens here as of verse 19. As often as it passes through, it will take you. For morning by morning it shall pass through, by day and by night it shall be nothing but terror to understand the message. For the bed is shorter than a man can stretch himself out on it, and the covenant they can wrap himself in it. They enter the covenant for reasons of security and comfort. When it is broken, they get a strong measure of insecurity and discomfort. And the picture of extreme discomfort is given two illustrations in verse 20. First of all, it's like trying to stretch yourself out on the bed, but the bed is simply too short for you. Or secondly, trying to wrap yourself up in a blanket and give yourself protection from the cold, but the blanket is too small to cover all of you. Now, being a 5'4" Jewish kid, I never had this first experience. I have no idea what it must feel like to stretch myself out in a bed and not succeed. Every time I try to do so, I've succeeded admirably. Some problems you don't have when you're 5'4". I have every so often I've been leading a 5-week study tour of Israel, and back in '78, one of the participants was a professional basketball player with the San Antonio Spurs. He was just under 7 feet tall. The only Philistine ever came on my trips like this. And because in Israel they make beds for my size people, at breakfast he would complain to me more than once about a very uncomfortable night because he couldn't stretch himself out on the bed. I had no way to identify myself with his trials and tribulations whatsoever. I have had the second experience. I was still a student at the Hebrew University. It was January 1967. And those of us majoring in archaeology and historical geography of the land of Israel were sent into the Negev Desert to do some practical archaeological explorations. This was about 5 or 6 months before the Six-Day War, and so the old Judean border came to the heartland of present-day Israel. And the area we were working was near the old Judean border. As for reasons of security, you had to spend the night near a military encampment near the border. And the Negev Desert can be quite hot in the day, but can also get miserably cold at night. And the blanket I was issued that first night was too small for a 5'4" Jewish kid. And I tried to keep my feet warm, my nose would freeze. As I tried to keep my nose warm, my feet would get cold. And all night long, the story kept repeating itself. I would fall asleep, break up, because that stupid blanket wouldn't cover all of me. It was a night of discomfort, which is the point of verse 20. Verse 21, for Jehovah rises up as in Mount Perazim, could be wrought in the valley of Gibeon, that he may do his work, his strange work, and bring to pass his act, his strange act. Now therefore be ye not scoffers, lest your bonds be made strong for him. A decree of destruction ever heard from the Lord, Jehovah of hosts, upon the whole earth. The Bible gives us many different names for the tribulation. Here are two such names, Jehovah's strange work and Jehovah's strange act. It is both a strange work and a strange act because the closing phrase of verse 22, God now issues a decree of destruction against the whole earth. And this decree of destruction is the same as the seventh sealed scroll of Revelation chapters 5 and 6. And as each seal is broken, there is a massive destruction of the earth's population, a massive destruction of the earth's surface. By the time the 7 years have run their course, somewhere between 2/3 and 3/4 of the earth's surface will be destroyed, and an equal percentage of the earth's population. But again, God will issue this decree of destruction as a result of the signing of the covenant here on earth. Insofar as the start of the tribulation, then, the tribulation cannot and will not begin until there is a signing of a 7-year treaty between Israel and the Antichrist. Now, the third thing to discuss is the Jews in the tribulation, what happens to them during these 7 years. And in time that we have, we'll limit ourselves to 4 passages on your outline, beginning with Jeremiah chapter 30. Jeremiah chapter 30. Jeremiah chapter 30, verse 4. Jeremiah 30, verse 4. Now these are the words that Jehovah spake concerning Israel, concerning Judah. For thus says Jehovah, we heard a voice of trembling and of fear, not of peace. Ask ye now and see whether man does travail with child. Wherefore do I see every man with his hands as loins, his woman travail, and all faces are turned into paleness. Alas, for that day is grace, so there is none like it. It is even the time of Jacob's trouble, but he shall be saved out of it. As I mentioned a few moments ago, the Bible gives us many different names for the tribulation. Here in verse 7, we're given a name which directly relates to tribulation to the Jewish people. It's called the day, the time of Jacob's trouble. It is very true, everybody in the tribulation suffers, but the Jewish people will suffer more so. That's because of a principle found in Isaiah chapter 40, verse 1 and 2. Isaiah 40, verse 1 and 2, that says Israel receives double for her sins. So when God punishes the Gentiles, he'll punish them this much. Israel is punished this much. And because Israel receives double for her sins, the tribulation becomes uniquely the time of Jacob's trouble. How much more they suffer, we'll see in the next 3 passages. But notice one more thing in verse 7, where that does contain a promise. No matter how bad it might get for the Jewish people as a people will survive it. Second passage will be Matthew chapter 24. Matthew 24, verse 15, when therefore you see the abomination of desolation, which was spoken of through Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place, them that reads understand, then let them that in Judea flee into the mountains. Let him that is on the housetop not go down to take out the things which are in his house. Let him that is in the field not return back to take his cloak. But woe unto you that are with child, them that give suck in those days, and pray that your flight be not in winter, neither on a Sabbath. For then shall be great tribulation, such as has not been from the beginning of the world until now, no, nor ever shall be. Except those days have been shortened, no flesh will have been saved, but for elect's sake, those days shall be shortened. In verse 15, it gives a warning sign to Jewish people living at the midpoint of tribulation, that when they see the abomination of desolation, that'll be the exact point of time the Antichrist will break his 7-year treaty at the midpoint of 7 years, take over the Jewish temple, seat himself in it, proclaim himself to be God Almighty, and call upon the whole world to worship him as God and to signify their acceptance of his deity by taking the mark of 666. When the Jewish people hear of this event, they must get out of Israel and get out of Israel quickly. And the whole tenor and the passage upon the need of speed and haste without a single second to lose. If you happen to be on the housetop for any reason, don't go off the roof and go inside the house to take any possessions. As soon as your foot touches the ground, make your way out of the country. Or if you're plowing in the field and you hear of this event taking place, don't go back to the kibbutz living quarters to take even so much as a coat. From the plow, make your way out of the country. For at this point, worldwide anti-Semitism breaks out in full force. And with the abomination, Satan signals his final attempt to annihilate the Jewish people once and for all, for reasons we'll mention in a few moments. Now, in verse 20, 2 prayer requests are urged that when this event occurs, prayer won't happen either in the Sabbath day or in the winter. But why not in winter? Because it seldom snows in Israel. What will be the problem of winter? And there are several differences between the United States and the state of Israel. One of these differences is the weather pattern. Here in America, we receive rain in all 4 seasons. Not so in Israel. There's a fixed rain season pattern. The rains begin to fall at the end of October. Rains will fall in November, December, January, and February. Will begin to peter out in March and die out by mid-April. From mid-April to mid-October, no rain falls. Another difference is the way highways happen to be built. When Americans build a highway and come to a water gully, even if it's a dry water gully, the American way is to build a bridge across it. Not so in Israel, where the water gullies were paved, where the roads were paved in these water gullies and up out again. These gullies are known as wadis, W-A-D-I. W-A-D-I. A wadi is dry all of summer, it's also dry most of winter. But during the rain season, when the rains fall upon the mountains of Israel, water begins rushing down these wadis with tremendous force, carrying tons of rock and debris, often destroying these highways. And when I was living in Israel, more than once I had to make a major detour or go back to where I came from because a wadi had destroyed a highway just that way. Now, when the Jews flee the land, they'll have to make use of these wadis. If it happens to happen in the winter months, it could be that much more dangerous. How dangerous it could be was made vivid about 20-some years ago, where 40 French tourists were walking down a wadi heading for an archaeological site. It was not raining where they happened to be hiking. It began raining elsewhere. Waters began to rush down. Within only 30 minutes, 38 of these 40 French tourists drowned. Only 2 survived. So pray that your flight be not in winter. The second prayer request, pray won't happen the Sabbath day either. Why not in the Sabbath? In Israel, on the Sabbath day, which is from sundown Friday till sundown Saturday, all public transportation closes down. No buses or trains are running. Unless you have your own automobile, it makes escape that much more difficult. In the last census, only about 50% of the Israeli Jewish population had their own cars, which were dependent upon public transportation, which is non-existent on the Sabbath day. So pray that your flight be not on the Sabbath. But the whole tenor of this passage is that the midpoint of tribulation, it won't happen before, but the midpoint, the state of Israel will collapse. There'll be one more forced exile from the land, a short exile around the Middle East nations that ultimately will lead them to final regeneration, the second coming, and the final restoration. Now go to Revelation 12. Revelation 12 is the one chapter within this book that deals with our present topic about the Jews in the tribulation. Again, it presupposes some Old Testament knowledge. And it begins with a historical summary to explain why Satan hates the Jewish people. And so in verses 1 through 5, we have a historical summary. In the verses 1 to 2, he sees the vision of a woman arrayed with the sun, moon, and stars. Now, if you believe in replacement theology, you identify this woman to be the church. But here again, John is simply presupposing Old Testament knowledge. In this case, Genesis chapter 37, verses 9 through 11. Genesis 37, 9 through 11, where we learn the moon, the sun represents Jacob. The moon is Rachel, the symbol of Jewish motherhood. And also 12 stars are the 12 sons of Jacob, who in turn father the 12 tribes of Israel. So this woman throughout this chapter represents the people of Israel, portrayed as a woman because in the Old Testament, Israel was portrayed as the wife of Jehovah. But in verses 1 and 2, there's a certain important history, which is just before the first coming, just before Messiah's birth. Then in verse 3 and 4, we see a second part of the vision in which Satan brings his entire demonic cohort down to the earth to try to destroy the child when the child is born. And the first stage of this was done with the slaughter of the babes of Bethlehem. But throughout his life and ministry, attempts are made to kill him either the wrong time, before or after Passover, the wrong manner, like by sword and by stoning. All such attempts failed with the statement, his hour was not yet come. His hour did come. He died at the proper time, in the proper way. The atonement was made. And in verse 5, he's caught up to God's throne, where he sits now at the right hand of God the Father. So the first 5 verses gives us a historical summary of the whole life of Messiah from just before his birth until his ascension, some 35, 6 or 7 years. And the purpose is to show that the reason Satan hates the Jews is because they produced a Messiah destined to defeat him. In verse 6, we find ourselves in the same place we were with Matthew 24. And the woman fled into the wilderness, where she had a place prepared of God, that they may nourish her 1,260 days. As in Matthew 24, so here, the woman was fleeing. And in Matthew 24, she flees to the mountains. Here she flees to the desert, to one specific place God has prepared in advance. And there she hides for 3.5 years, the second 3.5 years of tribulation. Now, while verse 6 tells us the woman flees, it doesn't say why she is fleeing. That's explained by verses 7 through 12. And the reason is that at this point, Satan, who now lives in the atmospheric heavens, according to Ephesians 2:2 and 6:12, Ephesians 2:2 and 6:12, will be cast down to the earth. He loses free access into heaven to be the accuser of the brethren. As a result, the end of verse 12 we read, "Woe for the earth and for the sea, because the devil has gone down unto you, because gone down to you, having great wrath, knowing he had but a short time." And once Satan is confined to the earth in the second half of the tribulation, he knows his time is short, only 3.5 years before the second coming. And knowing his time is short, he is very angry. Now, what will he be doing with the anger? Now, verse 6 again, the woman flees. The reason in verse 12, the wrath of Satan. And now notice how verse 13 and 14 pick up the thoughts of verse 6 and verse 12. "And when the dragon saw that it was cast down to the earth, he persecuted the woman that brought forth the man-child. And they were given the woman the 2 wings of the great eagle, that she might fly into the wilderness unto her place, where she is nourished for a time and times and a half a time from the face of the serpent." The woman is fleeing because Satan now has begun a program of trying to annihilate the Jews once and for all. At the midpoint of tribulation, he will inaugurate a Nazi-like program to try to destroy every Jew living at this point of time. The reason I'll explain in just a moment. But to what extent will he be successful? Turn now to Zechariah chapter 12. Zechariah 13. If you're not familiar with the prophets of the minor prophets, Zechariah will be the second book from the back of the Old Testament. The second book from the back. The last book is the Italian prophet, Malachi. Let's go past the Malachi papers. And look at verse 8. Chapter 13, verse 8. "It shall come to pass in all the land, says Jehovah, 2 parts therein shall be cut off and die, but the third shall be left therein. Now bring the third part into the fire. I will refine them as silver is refined. I will try them as gold is tried. They shall call on my name, and I will hear them. And I will say, it is my people, and they shall say, Jehovah is my God." According to Zechariah, 2/3 the Jewish population living at the time the tribulation begins will not survive it. 1/3 will survive it. And this 1/3 becomes the element that will ultimately bring about Israel's national salvation and in turn the second coming. Now, just briefly under capital E, the 4 groups of Jews that will be found in the tribulation. The first group are the 144,000 Jews that will be all single males that God will use for the purpose of evangelizing the world at that point of time. The second group we can simply call other Jewish believers, Jews who come to faith throughout the 7 years, but they're not part of that number. The third grouping calls simply the apostate Jews, which comprise approximately 2/3 the Jewish population of that day. These are the many that will make the covenant, and primarily they will be the ones that will die off in the 7-year tribulation persecution. Now, the fourth group we call the faithful remnant that comprise approximately 1/3 of the Jewish population of that day. They go through the 7 years unbelievers insofar as Jesus is concerned, also unbelievers as far as the Antichrist is concerned. These are the non-many that refuse anything to do with the covenant. And they'll be the ones that will succeed in escaping to the mountains of Matthew 24 and the wilderness of Revelation 12. And they have the power of the second coming. Now, briefly, let me cover the fourth point. As I mentioned, I won't go into all the details here because I usually do a 4-day prophetic conference, and I have one full session on the basis of the second coming and another full session on the campaign of Armageddon. Now, one of the differences between the rapture of the church and the second coming is this. The rapture has no preconditions whatsoever. It could happen any moment of time, even today. And the rapture is for God's program for the church. But the second coming is God's program for Israel and has one key precondition, which is Israel's national salvation. And there must be a national salvation of Israel before Jesus can return. Let me give you some passages you can just mark down, look up at your own leisure. You can mark down, for example, Leviticus chapter 26, verses 40 through 42, Leviticus 26, verses 40 through 42. Jeremiah chapter 3, verses 11 through 18, Jeremiah 3, 11 through 18. Hosea chapter 5, verse 15 through chapter 6, verse 3, Hosea 5, 15 through chapter 6, verse 3. Zechariah chapter 12, verse 10 through chapter 13, verse 1. Zechariah 12, 10 to 13, 1. And also Matthew chapter 23, verses 37 to 39, Matthew 23, 37 to 39. There must be a national salvation of Israel before there can be a second coming, and Satan knows that. And that's why he's always had this endless war against the Jews. That's why things like the pogroms occurred. That's why the Crusades occurred. That's why the Holocaust occurred. And that's why in Revelation 12, as we saw, once Satan is confined to the earth, he knows his time is short, and knowing it, he wants to wipe out the Jews. That's the only way he can avoid the second coming. However, as the Hosea passage I gave you shows, in the last 3 days, all this will come to saving faith. It'll happen as part of the campaign of Armageddon, and the campaign of Armageddon is 8 specific stages. In the 6th stage, we have Israel's national salvation. And that'll be followed, the 5th stage, you'll have Israel's national salvation, followed by the 6th stage, the second coming. And once all Israel is saved, that'll bring about the second coming of the Messiah. So the way the Jews relate to the close of the tribulation is, it closes only with Israel's national salvation that will then trigger the second coming, which triggers the establishment of the Messianic kingdom and Israel's final restoration in faith for the blessings of the kingdom. Let me again remind you, if you like to get this kind of material, Bible studies from a Jewish background, at our table in the cafeteria section of the chapel, you'll find these blue brochures. It's about our ministries, and there's a place in it you can fill your name and address. Simply fill the coupon out, tear it off, and leave it on the table. And if you fill this out, we'll send you some more information about the ministry, including information about our webpage, our correspondence course. We'll send you a copy of the catalog and a copy of my testimony. After that, we'll send you my newsletter that goes out every 3 months, 4 times a year. And inside 4 pages will always be written out Bible study. This is available to you free of charge. So if you want to receive it, simply fill out this form and turn it in. And as far as the books on the table, you can order those on the table. And the book that's most relevant to what we have been dealing with here is called The Footsteps of the Messiah. I'll study the sequence of prophetic events that will fill you in on some of the details here. I was told to finish at 10:05. It is 10:04. I finished a minute early. Who's in charge here?